Why had the guard smirked when he closed the iron door, as if he'd already seen her fate written out? The hinges groaned shut, leaving her in silence. A silence too deliberate, too smug, as though the enemy commander's words were meant to echo until they poisoned her. One American soldier won't last a week here. She sat on the cold concrete, shackles pressing against raw skin, the damp of the underground cell rising through her fatigues. The smell of rust, sweat, and something older, like stone that had been soaked in fear for decades, surrounded her. But she didn't fold. She didn't cry. She slowed her breath until it barely stirred her chest, her mind already calculating. That smirk, it wasn't confidence. It was blindness. Isabella, 26, staff sergeant, airborne medic, knew how men like him thought. They saw her braid tucked under a helmet, saw the word medic stitched onto her uniform, saw a woman alone in a cage. They assumed fragility, a healer, not a fighter. They mistook silence for surrender. And yet her silence had never meant weakness. It meant patience. The first hours bled into a night where no moonlight reached the cell. Guards walked past in twos, boots scuffing on the gravel above. She pressed her back to the wall, counting the intervals, memorizing their rhythm. 3 minutes between each pass. 7 seconds pause at the gate. 14 steps until they disappeared into the courtyard. Details the guards thought invisible, details she never failed to see. But even as she worked her mind, a question whispered at her ribs, a voice that had been there since the ambush. Why was she the one left alive? She replayed the explosion in her skull, rock, dust, screams, the sudden white flash. She'd been bent over a bleeding sergeant, pressing gauze against an artery, when the blast separated her from the team. When she lifted her head, there was no one, just enemy shadows circling like wolves who had studied her every move. They hadn't killed her, not then, which meant they wanted her alive. That was worse. Her chest tightened with something she refused to name: fear, guilt, anger. She could stitch wounds shut, restart a stopped heart, and keep a soldier breathing through chaos, but she couldn't silence the memory of those last faces before the smoke swallowed them. She didn't know if they'd lived, if she'd failed. And she hated not knowing more than the hunger clawing at her stomach. Still, her grandfather's voice cut through the haze. Little warrior, survival isn't about the weapon in your hand. It's about the weapon in your mind. They'll try to convince you you're trapped, but you're never trapped, not if you can think. The old man had spent years pounding that lesson into her, not in classrooms but in the jagged Montana wilderness. He'd blindfold her and drop her miles from home with nothing but a knife. He'd track her across ridges, force her to live on roots, set snares, read the earth the way Blackfoot hunters once had. Every scar on her hands was proof of a truth he had drilled into her. Your enemy may control the terrain, but they'll never control your will. And now, sitting in a Syrian mountain compound, bruised but breathing, she felt his words burning through her chest like tinder waiting for a spark. The spark came on the third night. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't slept, not fully, not more than shallow dips into restless half-dreams where her pulse betrayed her. The enemy commander, Raman, had not yet begun the methods he was known for. He thought hunger and silence would soften her first, but she saw something different in his delay: arrogance. A man so certain of his victory that he forgot time could be weaponized. When the guard entered with a tin bowl of rice, Isabella lifted her eyes just long enough to memorize him. Young, nervous hands, loose grip on his weapon. He didn't meet her gaze, didn't expect her to study the way his belt sagged from carrying too much gear he didn't understand. She coughed as though weak. He grinned, muttered something under his breath, and left. She didn't move for minutes. Then she tilted the bowl, a crack in the bottom, barely noticeable but sharp enough. She ran her finger across it and felt a jagged edge, small but usable. Her pulse quickened, not from fear but the first taste of opportunity. Survival begins when you notice what others don't. She tucked the shard beneath her sleeve. And for the first time since capture, she let herself whisper, "I'm still here." But she wasn't just here. She was waiting, watching, erasing the barrier between prey and predator, breath by steady breath. Outside, men laughed. Boots stomped. A radio hissed static, then cut. She listened to every sound as if it were part of a map only she could see. And as her mind mapped, something else rose inside, an ache sharper than hunger. She thought of her team, the men she had patched up 100 times, the ones who had joked that she had more grit than all of them combined, even as they teased her for being the kid at 19 when she first deployed. She thought of Sergeant Miller's voice yelling over gunfire Viper, "Move before the blast ripped them apart." She hadn't moved fast enough. She hadn't saved him, and that failure festered, poisoning the edges of her focus. But grief could wait. Guilt could burn later. Right now, she had to be what they had always trusted her to be: steady, ruthless, alive. The fifth night, the pattern shifted. Two guards stopped at her cell. They whispered, glancing down at her as if she were already broken. One gestured, laughing as though betting how long she'd last. She closed her eyes, feigning weakness, letting her breath hitch as though her body were collapsing. They bought it. Their laughter echoed down the corridor, growing faint. She opened her eyes again. Not broken, not weak. Just calculating. She pressed her palm against the wall. The vibration told her more than the eye could. A door slamming in the courtyard. A generator humming unevenly near the surface. Pipes running along the ceiling carrying water she could hear drip in 3 distinct places. All of it mattered. All of it was part of the system she would dismantle, one piece at a time. And in that silence, a dangerous thought grew. Escape wasn't enough. They had taken her. They had mocked her. They had planned to use her as propaganda, a message that America's soldiers, even its women, could be broken. If she escaped, they would hunt again. If she simply survived, others would fall. Her jaw tightened. No. Escape wasn't the mission. Erasure was. By the 7th day, the guards had stopped laughing. One had gone missing. Rumors rippled through the compound, though no one dared speak loudly enough for Raman to hear. Isabella listened from her cell, her heart steady, her mind sharper than the shard hidden against her wrist. They didn't know yet. They didn't understand what had already begun. But she did. Because the shift had happened quietly, almost invisibly. Somewhere between the first night of despair and the moment she cut her palm to test the shard's edge, she had stopped being their prisoner and started becoming their shadow. What they didn't realize was that a week was too long to leave her breathing, too long to underestimate her silence. The commander thought the walls were her cage, but she knew better. The walls weren't trapping her. They were trapping them. How do you measure time when the sun never reaches you? In Isabella's cell, there was no dawn, no dusk, only footsteps, only voices above, only the sound of a world pretending she was forgotten. Yet she could feel it, time passing like a current, pulling her forward toward something she could neither see nor stop. But captivity wasn't silence anymore. It was a conversation. The pipes whispered. The ground trembled with movement, and her mind, sharpened to a blade, answered back. On the 8th night, one guard didn't return. His absence stirred murmurs in the courtyard, boots packing harder, voices edged with nerves. Isabella sat against the wall, feigning dullness, but inside she marked it, the first cut in the fabric. The missing guard wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. It was her. And though she hadn't killed him, hadn't needed to, the act had already begun to rewrite the story. She had slipped her hand through the bars during his routine, coughed weakly, whispered something he didn't quite catch. He leaned closer, smug, eager to hear what the broken American would say. That was his mistake. In a blink, she jammed the jagged shard against his neck's pressure point, cutting off his breath without leaving blood. His body convulsed once, then sagged into silence. She dragged him just close enough to strip the keys, the pistol, the belt. Then she shoved his weight beneath a tarp of rags stored against the corridor wall. The next patrol passed without looking. Now his weapon sat beneath a loose stone in her cell, wrapped in cloth to keep from clinking. It felt wrong, almost sinful, to hold it. She was a medic. Her hands were trained to stop bleeding, not cause it. But the truth was simple. The line between healer and killer had never been clean. She had seen men survive because she could fire, and she had seen men die because she couldn't fire fast enough. Survival meant holding both roles. Tonight, survival meant carrying that pistol. Still, her pulse thudded with a heaviness she couldn't admit aloud. Taking life, even an enemy, carried a weight. Her grandmother had warned her as a child. Every hunter eats the spirit of what it kills. Make sure the spirit doesn't consume you. Was it consuming her already? The second guard to vanish was different. He was careful, alert, no laughter in his eyes, only discipline. She watched him for 2 days, his habits, his paths. He never strayed, never broke rhythm. The kind of man Raman trusted. But discipline has its cracks. She timed her moment when a generator sputtered, plunging the corridor into near darkness for 10 heartbeats. In those breaths, she slid from shadow, looped his own strap across his windpipe and squeezed. He struggled, strong, desperate, but she whispered into his ear as he flailed, "I'm sorry." She meant it. Because she wasn't just killing guards, she was killing parts of herself. Still, when his body fell limp, she felt something colder than guilt. She felt power. And she knew power frightened her. She hit him deeper this time, pulling his body into the abandoned maintenance shaft she had mapped through sound. A shaft that now became hers, her base, her den. From there she could move, listen, strike. Days blurred, the compound shifted. Men who once strutted now looked over their shoulders. Radios barked half-sentences of panic. 2 guards searched together where once one had walked alone. Raman's voice grew sharper, his orders clipped, his temper strained. She heard it all from her tunnel, crouched in shadows, eating scraps, studying every movement like prey does the hunter. But who was prey now? On the 10th day, the air in the compound carried something different, fear. They didn't say it aloud, but she could taste it. The way boots scuffed quicker, the way rifles clutched, the way laughter had died. Fear, once planted, spread faster than infection. And fear was her new weapon. She struck again that night, this time the communications operator. She crept in silent as breath, pistol raised, shard tucked between her fingers like a fang. He never saw her. One choke, one twist, one cut of wire, and the radio that linked Raman's network dissolved into static. She dragged his body aside, then sat before the blinking console. Lines of enemy chatter scrolled, coordinates, plans, future strikes against her people. Her chest tightened. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was holding lives, hundreds of them, in her hands. For a moment, the medic inside her reemerged, the woman who believed in protecting life above all. She could almost feel the pulse of every American soldier in those distant bases, beating steady, unaware that tonight a prisoner in a mountain cell had just shifted their fates. She downloaded what she could onto a stolen drive, tucked it into her fatigues, and exhaled slow. This wasn't escape, this was war. And for the first time since capture, she whispered a promise, not to herself but to her lost team. "I'll finish what they started. I won't waste what you gave me." By the time dawn cracked across the compound, 3 guards were gone. The operator was gone, the radio silent, and the medic who was supposed to break. She was gone too. Not dead, not escaped. Just everywhere. The men whispered now of a ghost, of a shadow that breathed down their necks, that slipped through locked doors, that turned sleep into a gamble. Raman raged, but even he looked over his shoulder now. And in her tunnel, Isabella waited, pulse steady, guilt and resolve braided into one. She hadn't answered the question haunting her, the question of how much of herself she was sacrificing each time she pulled the trigger. But maybe answers could wait. What mattered now was that fear had shifted. It no longer lived in her chest. It lived in theirs. And fear, she knew, was the beginning of their end. What did fear sound like when it spread through hardened men? It was in the silence between their conversations, the sudden cut-off of laughter. It was in the rattle of a rifle's sling clutched too tightly, in the uneven packing of boots against stone. To most, those details would pass unnoticed. To Isabella, crouched in the maintenance shaft, they were louder than any scream. Fear was working. But it wasn't enough. She knew fear could break an army, but it could also make one reckless. Cornered men did desperate things, and desperate things killed innocents. If she wanted to dismantle this compound, she couldn't simply haunt them. She needed to control them, hurting their paranoia until it devoured itself. The medic in her hesitated at the thought. She could hear her grandmother's voice even now. To hunt is to unbalance. But remember, little wolf, every trap you set ensnares you too. Kill enough times and you will no longer remember who you were before the hunt. Was she already forgetting? She touched the shard hidden at her wrist. It was stained now, not with blood, but with memory. Each time she used it, she felt a part of herself slipping further away from the girl who once braided her hair at dawn before PT, the medic who once carried gauze instead of pistols. But what choice did she have? They had chosen this. All she was doing now was refusing to lose it. On the 11th day, she tested the edges of her new war. A guard patrolled near the outer courtyard, his weapon slung casually though his eyes darted left and right. Isabella followed from shadow to shadow barefoot, moving with the silent patience her grandmother had drilled into her in Montana woods. When he stopped to light a cigarette, she slipped behind him, snatched the lighter from his pocket and disappeared. That night the man searched his uniform again and again, muttering. By morning, rumors spread that the ghost was taking things. Weapons, tools, trinkets. It didn't matter if it was true. She had planted the seed, and paranoia grew faster than hunger. By the 13th day, 2 more guards had vanished. One into the tunnel, his throat silenced by cloth before he could even reach for his weapon. The other into the generator room, his body left hanging just long enough to be found. It wasn't cruelty, it was calculation. She wanted them to know. Raman stormed the courtyard that morning, shouting until spit clung to his beard. His men stood stiff, eyes darting, each wondering if the comrade next to him might vanish before the week was done. Raman raged that an outsider was among them, some infiltrator, some betrayal. He refused to believe the prisoner could be behind it all. That disbelief was her shield. From her shaft, Isabella watched his face twist with anger. He thought he understood Americans, predictable, reliant on tech, incapable of surviving without gadgets and superiority. He didn't understand what her grandfather had forged into her bones, that survival wasn't a matter of strength, but of patience. Still, as she clutched the stolen drive full of enemy plans against her chest, she felt the ache again. This wasn't her mission. She had been a medic assigned to keep others alive. Now she was rewriting the entire scope of her war. Would they even recognize her when she returned? If she returned. That night the compound boiled with tension. Guards doubled their watches, weapons raised at shadows. Raman barked new orders, sending half his men to sweep the perimeter. The others clutched rifles at the slightest sound. And Isabella waited. Patience, she reminded herself. Fear was not about striking fastest. Fear was about making them strike at each other. She crawled into the ventilation shaft above their barracks, her body pressed against steel, her breath controlled until it matched the hum of the pipes. Below, men muttered in low voices, trading stories of the vanished. She flicked the stolen lighter once, twice, letting sparks fall through the grate. Just sparks, no flame, enough to start a rumor. By morning it had grown into certainty. The ghost carried fire. And fire in this dry mountain compound meant destruction. That day one fighter accused another of negligence, claiming he had seen him drop a cigarette. A scuffle broke. Fists, then knives. By the time Raman arrived, one was dead, throat cut by his own comrade. She hadn't lifted a weapon, but she had killed him all the same. The weight pressed heavy. She crouched in her tunnel that night, hands trembling, breath shallow. She had sworn once back in training that she would never let war rot her soul the way it had some of the older medics. She had sworn she would keep her humanity, that she would remain more healer than killer. And yet here she was, watching men destroy each other while her own silence guided the blade. Tears burned her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Not here, not where the walls might carry the sound back to listening ears. Instead, she whispered, "I'm sorry," to no one in particular, to the guard, to her team, maybe even to herself. But apology didn't change necessity. On the 15th day, Raman made his move. He gathered the remaining men in the courtyard, rifles in hand, eyes sunken from sleepless nights. He shouted promises of revenge, curses against the Americans, threats of punishment if the ghost wasn't found. And then he pointed toward her cell. She was there waiting. He dragged her out before them, shackled wrists, dirt on her fatigues. He wanted a display, proof that she was still his prisoner, that the vanishings weren't her doing. He wanted to crush their paranoia by reminding them of the helpless American woman caged in their walls. The men laughed nervously, a few spit near her boots. She kept her eyes down, shoulders slumped. She let them believe it. And as Raman shoved her back into the cell, smirking again as if balance had returned, she hid the smile curling at her lips. Because none of them saw the key she had lifted from his pocket. They didn't know the predator was still among them. And they didn't know she had just been handed the final piece to their collapse. What does power feel like when it hides in the palm of your hand? For Isabella, it was the weight of a single key pressed against her skin. Thin, ordinary, forgettable. Yet it carried the shape of freedom, the outline of every locked door in the compound. She had slipped it from Raman's pocket as easily as a surgeon plucked shrapnel from flesh. Now it rested against her wrist bone, taped under her sleeve, pulsing with possibility. But power alone was nothing. Power demanded choice, and choice carried a cost. That night she sat in the darkness of her cell, running her thumb over the hidden metal. She thought of her team, the ones she'd lost in smoke and fire. She thought of Miller, the last face she had seen before the blast, his voice urging her to move. Had he lived? Or was she the only one left to carry the story? The guilt twisted like wire in her chest. She had promised once to save lives, not take them. Now every choice she made, every step she took through the compound chipped at that vow. Yet survival demanded something harsher, and she couldn't deny it anymore. Part of her had stopped running from what she was doing. Part of her was beginning to embrace it. She moved that night, not to escape but to expand. The key slid into the corridor lock with a quiet click. For the first time since capture, the door swung open without resistance. She stepped into the hall, the air colder here, the silence stretched taut. Every shadow was a chance, every echo a warning. She slipped toward the armory. 2 guards posted, their eyes scanning nervously. They whispered to each other, glancing often at the corners as if expecting the ghost to materialize. She crouched behind a stack of crates, heart steady. How many more before she lost herself completely? She lifted the shard, its edge reflecting a thread of light. Her hands didn't tremble anymore. That, she realized, frightened her most. The strike was clean. 2 muffled gasps, 2 bodies lowered into silence. She dragged them aside, stripped ammunition belts, lifted rifles, and tucked explosives into her pack. Each movement was mechanical, precise, without hesitation. When the armory was empty, she planted the first trap, a timed charge hidden beneath a crate of grenades. Not to kill, not yet, but to remind Raman's men that even their strongest fortress was nothing more than tinder. By dawn, the explosion rattled the compound. Shouts filled the air, orders barked, confusion reignited. Raman stormed through the courtyard, his voice hoarse from rage. He accused betrayal. He cursed his men. He threatened executions if the ghost was not found. Isabella watched from above, crouched in the rafters of a half-collapsed storage bay. The chaos below was almost too easy. Fear had made them clumsy. Suspicion had turned them against each other. Her work was becoming less about striking and more about waiting. Still, as she crouched in silence, she felt something gnawing at her ribs. She was good at this, too good. Her grandfather had always said she carried the mind of a predator. Her grandmother had warned that such a mind was a dangerous gift. Tonight, she feared both had been right. The men grew restless, sleep-starved, nerve-shaken. Some refused to patrol alone. Others vanished into the night desert, abandoning their posts rather than face the ghost. Raman responded with cruelty. He dragged 2 of his men into the courtyard and shot them before the rest. Their bodies were left there, broken warnings. The message was clear: fear me more than her. But Isabella understood something he didn't. Fear born from cruelty had limits. Fear born from the unseen, that was limitless. So she moved again, striking not at bodies but at their minds. She left boots neatly aligned outside one man's quarters, boots she had taken from the dead. She scattered spent shells in places no gunfire had sounded. She drew lines of ash across walls like marks from another world. By the 18th day, men were whispering prayers in corners, eyes wide, sleep impossible. And Isabella's shadow stretched taller with every hour. Yet her chest ached with a weight she couldn't shake. Each time she tightened the noose, she thought of the faces she had once saved, soldiers who had clung to her voice as she worked to keep them alive. Now she spoke to no one. Now her hands brought only silence. Who was she becoming? The answer came when she stumbled across the photos. In Raman's bunker, rifling through crates of documents, she found a folder bound in string. Inside, snapshots. American soldiers captured, broken, used for propaganda. Some she didn't recognize, some she did. Faces she had trained with, faces she had once eaten with in dusty mess halls. And one face stopped her breath. Sergeant Miller. Alive. Or at least he had been when the picture was taken. His eyes were swollen, jaw bruised, but he was there. She sank to her knees, clutching the photo. Relief, horror, rage, it tore through her like fire in dry grass. They had him, maybe here, maybe somewhere nearby, and she was wasting time turning shadows against shadows. Her pulse hammered. The mission had shifted again. It wasn't just about survival. It wasn't even about erasing Raman's men anymore. Now it was about finding Miller. Finding him before fear became reality in his eyes. That night she struck harder. 2 more guards vanished, their rifles now hers. A corridor collapsed under another timed charge. Raman's compound trembled, his men scattering like ants under flame. And through it all, Isabella moved with new fire in her veins. Because now, for the first time since captivity, she wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for someone she still believed she could save. How do you hold on to hope when everything around you is built to kill it? For Isabella, it was a photograph. Sergeant Miller's swollen face, captured in grainy black and white, stared back at her from the folder she had pulled from Raman's desk. His eyes, though battered, still carried recognition. He was alive then, maybe alive now. And that possibility was enough to ignite something dangerous inside her, hope sharpened by rage. She tucked the photo into her uniform, close to her chest, as if keeping him there could protect him. But hope was not enough. She needed proof. She needed to find him before Raman realized what leverage he truly held. The compound was larger than she had imagined in those first days of captivity. Corridors snaked into hidden bunkers, tunnels cut into the mountain. She had only mapped fragments, but now her movements carried urgency. Every step through shadow was no longer just about dismantling the enemy. It was about searching. She listened. Every sound mattered. Guards muttering as they passed. The scrape of chains when food was dragged into unseen cells. The muffled coughs that came from deeper tunnels she hadn't yet explored. And on the 20th night she heard it, faint, almost drowned by the generator's hum. A voice, weak, hoarse, speaking English. Her breath caught. She followed the sound, slipping through maintenance shafts, down into a section she had avoided before. too heavily patrolled, too fortified. But desperation silenced hesitation. There it was again, a cough, then a word: help. Miller. Her heart thundered, her body pressed against the cold concrete as she peered through a vent. A dim cell lay below, and inside, hunched against the wall, was the man from the photo. Shackled, broken, but breathing. She nearly cried, but tears had no place here. Instead, she closed her eyes, whispering into the silence, "Hold on, I'm coming." The problem was simple and impossible at once. The cell was guarded by two men at all hours, the door reinforced, chains heavy enough to drag noise for yards if touched. She couldn't storm it, not without alerting half the compound. So she watched, night after night. She studied guard shifts, body language, weaknesses. One yawned too often, fighting exhaustion. The other picked at his nails when bored, small cracks, but cracks could widen. Her patience returned, the same patience that had kept her alive this long. But now waiting was agony. Each night she didn't move felt like betrayal. She replayed Miller's voice in her head, the rasp of it, the plea. And yet she forced herself to hold, to plan. Because one mistake didn't mean her death anymore. It meant his too. On the 23rd night, her chance came. The yawn struck first, the guard leaning against the wall, eyelids drooping. The other paced, distracted, muttering under his breath about the ghost. Fear had eaten them hollow. Isabella slipped from the vent, silent as her grandmother's shadow steps. She landed behind them, pistol raised. Two shots suppressed, soft as coughs. Two bodies collapsed. Her hands shook as she lowered the pistol, not from fear, from relief. She shoved the key into the lock, twisted, and dragged the heavy door open. Inside, Miller lifted his head, his eyes, bloodshot but alive, widened. "Viper," his voice cracked. Her throat tightened. For the first time in weeks, she heard her name, not spat by an enemy, not whispered by fear, but spoken by someone who knew her. "It's me," she whispered, crouching beside him. Her fingers moved instinctively, checking his pulse, his wounds, cataloging damage. Bruised ribs, dehydration, infection setting into cuts along his wrists. He needed treatment she didn't have, but he was alive. And for the first time, she felt like a medic again. "You shouldn't," he rasped, but she cut him off with a look. "I had to." Tears burned her eyes but didn't fall. Not here, not yet. She broke his chains with stolen tools, dragging him into the shaft. He winced with every movement, his breath ragged. She forced herself to slow, to steady him, even as urgency screamed inside her. When they reached her hidden den in the tunnels, she gave him water, wrapped his wrists with strips of cloth, and pressed a hand to his chest. His heart thudded weakly but steady. "You're safe now," she murmured, though both of them knew it wasn't true. Not yet. He looked at her, confusion cutting through the pain. How are you still alive?" She almost laughed, almost. Instead, she shook her head. "Long story." He studied her, eyes narrowing. "You've changed." The words struck deeper than she expected. She looked away, her fingers tightening on the cloth she used to bandage him. Changed. Yes, but into what? She wanted to say she was still the same medic, still the same soldier. But the ghosts of the men she had silenced whispered otherwise. "There's no time," she said instead, deflecting. "We need to finish this." "Finish?" he asked, voice cracking. She met his gaze, and the weight of what she had become pressed between them. "I'm not leaving until Ramon's done." Miller's face tightened, pain, disbelief, fear, all of it mixed in his eyes. "You can't take him alone." Her jaw clenched. "I already have." She didn't explain. She didn't need to. The missing guards, the explosions, the paranoia tearing the compound apart, that was her work. And now, with Miller at her side, even weakened, she wasn't just a ghost in the walls anymore. She was fire. Still that night, as Miller drifted into shallow sleep, Isabella sat awake, the pistol across her knees. She watched him breathe, each rise and fall of his chest proof that she hadn't lost everything. But she also knew the truth. Saving him had changed the mission again. Now she wasn't only dismantling Raman's empire. Now she was carrying another life in her hands, a life she couldn't afford to lose. And that meant her war had only grown more dangerous. The hunter had taken back her comrade. But the predator still waited. What happens when the ghost finally takes form? For weeks, Raman's men had spoken of shadows, of whispers in the dark, of enemies they couldn't see. But shadows can't carry another man on their shoulders. Ghosts don't leave footprints in the dust. And when Raman's patrols discovered the bodies of 2 guards left crumpled outside a broken cell, the illusion began to snap. Someone had freed the American. And Raman, for the first time, felt the truth burning his throat. It was her. The woman, the medic, the one he had mocked in front of his men. She hadn't broken. She hadn't begged. She had been moving through his walls all along, stripping his men piece by piece until fear was all they had left. His fury boiled, but under it coiled something worse, respect, and respect curdled into fear. For Isabella, the shift was immediate. The compound, once blind, was suddenly alive with the hunt. Lights burned through the night. Men shouted orders. Doors slammed. Footsteps pounded through every corridor. They weren't whispering about a ghost anymore. They were hunting a soldier. She tightened her grip on Miller's arm as she guided him through the tunnels. He was weak, staggering, every breath ragged, but his spirit hadn't cracked. "I can move," he insisted, though his voice trembled with pain. She slowed his steps anyway. His pride couldn't mask the truth. Without her, he wouldn't last an hour. The thought tore at her. She had been fighting alone so long that every decision had been hers alone to carry. Now, with Miller leaning on her, every risk, every sound she made, every corner she turned, his life was tied to it. And though relief still pulsed inside her at finding him alive, it came laced with guilt. If he hadn't been here, if she hadn't found him, she could have finished this war her way. Silent, clean, alone. Now, the medic inside her ward with the predator she had become. She couldn't let him die. Not after all this. Not after carrying his photograph against her chest like a vow. That night they reached her hidden den in the tunnels. She pressed food into his hands, scraps of bread, dried fruit scavenged from enemy stores. He ate with shaking fingers, his eyes never leaving her. "You did all this," he whispered finally, his voice hoarse. She looked away, her hands busy loading a stolen rifle. "I did what I had to." "Isabella," he shook his head, disbelief etched into every line of his face. You've turned this place upside down. Alone." Her jaw tightened, not alone anymore. Silence stretched. Then he asked the question she had been avoiding since she pulled him from the cell. "How many?" Her breath caught. The number flickered behind her eyes. Guards, operators, men she had silenced without hesitation, others she had driven into each other's knives. She could feel their ghosts pressing against her ribs. She didn't answer. Instead, she checked the rifle's magazine, her fingers steady though her chest burned. Miller didn't push, but she saw the shadow cross his face, the same shadow she had felt when she whispered sorry to the men she had killed. Maybe he was wondering the same thing she was. Was she still the medic he remembered, or had she become something else entirely? By the 25th day, Raman's desperation cracked into violence. He executed another 2 men in the courtyard, demanding loyalty. But Isabella saw the tremor in his hand when he pulled the trigger. His power was eroding. His men no longer feared him more than they feared her. That was the balance she had been waiting for. But Miller changed the calculus. She couldn't simply strike from shadows now. He couldn't move as silently, couldn't climb into vents or squeeze through shafts. If she fought her war the way she had before, he would be left behind. So she adapted. She began setting traps instead of strikes. Wire snares stretched across corridors. Trip charges built from stolen explosives. Noise diversions that drew guards into one corner while she moved Miller through another. Each move left the enemy chasing phantoms, while the real ghost carried her comrade deeper toward the heart of the compound. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of weight pressing heavier with every step. Miller's life, the ghosts of the men she had killed, the hundreds of soldiers outside this mountain who would die if Ramon's network lived. Her choices weren't clean. They were jagged, tearing her in two. And yet, when Miller's hand squeezed hers in the dark, she knew she couldn't stop. "You saved me," he whispered once, his voice thin but certain. She didn't reply, because the truth was sharper than the words he wanted. She hadn't saved him yet. Not until Ramon was dead. The final fracture came when she overheard Ramon's plan. Crouched above the command bunker, ear pressed against the vent, she listened as he barked into a backup radio. His voice was sharp, urgent. He was calling for reinforcements from cells scattered across the border. If they reached him in time, the compound would become a fortress again. She couldn't allow that. The decision formed like ice in her chest. She would end it before they came. No more waiting, no more shadows. Ramon had to fall now. She returned to Miller, her voice low, steady. "It's time." He looked at her, fear and faith warring in his eyes. "You're going after him." She nodded. "You'll never get close. He'll have guards." "I've been close every night since this started," she cut him off, her tone sharper than she meant. "He just never saw me." Miller fell silent, but his gaze didn't waver. "Then I'm with you." The words almost broke her. He could barely stand without leaning. His body was too weak, too, but his spirit, she saw the soldier still burning there. And she couldn't deny him that dignity. "Then stay close," she whispered. That night, the hunter and the half-broken soldier moved as one. Through the tunnels, past the bodies of guards who would never answer again, toward the command bunker where Ramon paced, fury and fear eating him alive. Every step closer, Isabella felt the weight shift. This wasn't just her war anymore. This was theirs. How do you walk into the lion's den knowing the lion already smells your blood? Isabella asked herself that as she crouched in the shadows with Miller at her side, staring at the faint glow spilling from the bunker door. Ramon was inside. The man who had mocked her, caged her, underestimated her. The man whose network threatened hundreds of her brothers and sisters in uniform. Her heart beat steady, but it wasn't calm. It was a drum, sharp and insistent. She shifted the rifle against her shoulder, feeling its weight. This wasn't the tool of a medic. It was a hunter's weapon, and she had become the hunter. Miller leaned against the wall, pale in the moonlight seeping through cracks in the compound. His breath came shallow, but his eyes never left hers. "You don't have to do this alone," he whispered. She almost smiled, almost. "I already have," she murmured back. But she knew what he meant. He wasn't just offering help. He was asking for dignity, for a chance to stand beside her, even broken, even bleeding. She nodded once, giving him that. The bunker loomed before them. Guards patrolled, weary but alert. They weren't laughing anymore. They weren't careless. Fear had sharpened them, made them dangerous, but fear also made them predictable. She whispered two on the left, one by the door. Miller tightened his grip on the pistol she'd pressed into his hand. His knuckles whitened, his jaw locked. For a moment, she saw the man she remembered from before the blast, steady, sharp, fearless. They moved. Isabella struck first, sliding through shadow, silencing one guard with a chokehold before his rifle even lifted. Miller raised his pistol, hands trembling but aim true. One shot. The second guard dropped. His breath came ragged, but pride flared in his eyes. The third spun at the sound, weapon rising. Isabella fired, a clean strike. The body fell heavy at the door. They froze, listening. No alarm, no shout, just silence heavy as stone. She turned to Miller, ready. He swallowed, nodded once. Together, they pushed into the bunker. The air inside was thick, oil lamps casting shadows across maps, crates of ammunition stacked high, wires trailing into radios. At the center, packing like a caged beast, was Raman. He looked up. For a heartbeat his eyes widened, recognition, then fury. "You," he spat, voice echoing against the concrete. "The medic, the woman." His lips curled into a snarl. "My men whisper of ghosts, they tremble like children, and all this time it was you." Isabella didn't flinch. She stepped further into the light, rifle steady. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." He laughed, bitter, sharp. "I wanted to break you first, show them how weak your kind are. A woman playing soldier, a medic pretending to fight." Her jaw tightened, but her voice stayed even. "You made a mistake. You thought survival was weakness." Raman's hand slipped to the pistol at his belt. His eyes burned. "And you think killing my men makes you strong?" Behind her, Miller staggered, lifting his pistol. "It makes her alive," he rasped. For the first time, Raman seemed to notice him. His grin widened. "Ah," the sergeant, still breathing barely. "What did she promise you? Survival, escape. She'll fail you too." Miller's grip faltered, his body trembling with exhaustion. Isabella shifted, putting herself between them, rifle locked on Raman. This wasn't about words anymore. It was about endings. But endings came heavy, because even as she aimed, her chest ached. Every choice she had made since captivity, every guard silenced, every body left behind, had been steps toward this moment. The medic she had once been was gone. The soldier remained. And she hated that part of her, didn't hate it. Raman's voice sliced the silence again. "Do it then, kill me. Show him what you've become." His challenge echoed in her skull. The predator inside her stirred, sharp and certain. But another voice rose too, her grandfather's, steady as stone. "Survival isn't about killing. It's about deciding who you refuse to let die." She hesitated. And in that heartbeat, Raman drew. The pistol flashed. Miller shoved her aside. The shot cracked, biting into his shoulder. He grunted, falling against the wall. "No," the word tore from her throat. Her rifle roared, the shot slamming into Raman's chest. He staggered, eyes wide, lips parting as if to curse her one last time. Then he crumpled, lifeless, against the maps that had charted his empire. Silence swallowed the bunker. Isabella's breath came hard, her hands shaking for the first time in weeks. She dropped to Miller's side, pressing her palms against his wound, her medic's instincts flooding back like muscle memory. "Stay with me," she whispered, voice breaking. "I've got you, I've got you." His eyes fluttered, pain tightening his face, but he managed a faint smile. "Still saving lives," he rasped. She bit back tears, pressing harder against the bleeding. "Yours first." Around them, the compound seemed to hold its breath. Raman was dead. His men would scatter. The network would crumble. She had done it. But victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like loss. Because with every breath Miller fought for, she realized the truth. She hadn't just killed Raman. She had killed the person she once was. And yet, as she looked into Miller's eyes, burning with stubborn life, she understood something else too. Maybe that was the cost. Maybe that was the price of keeping him. Happens when the war ends, but the silence does. The bunker was quiet now. Raman's body sprawled across his maps, his blood soaking the paper trails of attacks that would never happen. His empire had collapsed in the span of one bullet. But for Isabella, the real weight pressed against her hands, slick with Miller's blood as she worked feverishly to slow the bleeding. Her breath came shallow. Her voice, usually steady in battle, cracked as she muttered instructions, half for him, half for herself. "Stay awake, keep breathing, don't close your eyes." He tried to smirk, pain shadowing his features, bossy as ever. Tears pricked her eyes, but she held them back. She couldn't falter now. She had fought too hard to reach this point. She tightened the makeshift bandage, tore her own sleeve for more cloth, and pressed down harder. Every second stretched into an eternity. When Miller's breathing steadied, shallow but rhythmic, she finally allowed herself a breath. Relief washed through her so sharp it almost hurt. He was alive. But outside the bunker, the compound stirred with chaos. Ramon's men had seen their leader fall. Some fled into the night, dropping rifles as they ran. Others shouted in disarray. The chain of command snapped like brittle bone. The walls trembled with the sound of collapse, not from bombs or fire, but from the absence of the man who had ruled them through fear. Isabella knew they had minutes, maybe less, before the chaos either consumed them or closed in on them. She pulled Miller to his feet, slinging his arm over her shoulder. He groaned, but he didn't resist. Step by step, they staggered through the bunker, past the maps, past Ramon's corpse, past the shadows of everything she had become to reach this moment. The tunnels welcomed them like old allies. She moved quickly, guiding him into the hidden shaft that had been her sanctuary. Each footstep echoed with finality. This place had been her prison, her battlefield, her graveyard, and now it was her exit. Still, as they stumbled forward, she felt the ghosts pressing closer, the faces of the men she had silenced, the whispers of those who had fallen because she had chosen this path. She didn't hate them. She carried them, each one a reminder that survival was never clean. They reached the outer ridge by dawn. The desert spread wide and empty, the sky pale with early light. For the first time in nearly a month, Isabella felt air that wasn't choked by stone walls or gunpowder. Miller collapsed against a rock, his face pale, sweat beading on his skin. She knelt beside him, checking his pulse again, her medic's instincts guiding her hands. "You're not dying here," she whispered, more to herself than to him. He managed a weak laugh. "Not if you're in charge." Her chest tightened. She had carried so much, but this fragile thread of humor in the face of everything, reminded her who they were before the shadows, before the cages. She turned her eyes to the horizon. Somewhere out there, American forces patrolled. Somewhere out there, a signal would bring help. She pulled the stolen radio from her pack, fingers trembling as she adjusted frequencies. Static, then a voice. "Forward operating base Echo, identify." Her throat caught. She pressed the transmitter. "This is Staff Sergeant Isabella, code name Viper. I have one American soldier, wounded, extracted from enemy compound. Request immediate." Silence, then the reply came, incredulous. "Say again, did you say Viper?" "Yes," she said, her voice firm now. "We need extraction, coordinates uploading." A pause, then the words she hadn't dared hope to hear. "Copy that, hold position, bird inbound." She lowered the radio, her shoulders trembling. Miller closed his eyes, relief etched into his battered features. "Told you, bossy." She laughed once, soft, the sound raw and unfamiliar after weeks of silence. Minutes stretched like hours until the thrum of rotor blades cut through the desert sky. The helicopter crested the ridge, sunlight glinting off its frame, a sight more beautiful than anything she had seen in captivity. Dust whipped around them as it descended. Soldiers jumped out, weapons raised, scanning the perimeter. Their eyes fell on her, on the woman who had been reported captured, assumed dead, on the man she dragged to his feet, refusing to let him fall. They rushed forward, helping Miller aboard. One soldier, wide-eyed, turned to her. How did you get out?" She met his gaze, steady, unreadable. "I didn't." He frowned, confused, but she said no more. The helicopter lifted, the compound shrinking behind them, its walls crumbling into memory. Isabella sat by Miller's side, her hand pressed against his wound, her eyes locked on the horizon. She didn't feel like a hero, she didn't feel victorious. She felt hollow. Because survival always carried a cost. When they landed at the forward base, chaos erupted. Medics rushed Miller onto a stretcher, their voices urgent but confident. Officers demanded debriefs, their pens scratching furiously as she spoke of Ramon's network, of plans she had stolen, of cells she had dismantled. They listened with awe, with disbelief. Some looked at her like a legend, but she felt none of it. When one officer asked, "How did you survive it all?" She gave the only answer that felt true. I didn't survive it, I became it. Months later, the story spread of the medic who erased a compound one man at a time, who turned captivity into a weapon. Promotions followed, invitations to elite units, lectures to special forces cadets who wanted to learn from her. They called her Viper, whispered her story like myth. But when she was alone, she still carried the ghosts. She remembered every face, every silence, every moment where she had chosen to kill instead of heal. She remembered the shift inside her chest when fear stopped belonging to her and started belonging to them. She remembered Miller's blood on her hands, his voice pulling her back from the abyss with nothing more than a weak joke. And sometimes, in those moments of quiet reflection, she wondered if she had ever left that cell. Because maybe captivity wasn't chains, maybe captivity was memory. But she also knew this: captivity had not broken her, it had reshaped her. And as she stood before new soldiers, teaching them not just how to survive but how to think, she left them with one truth. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And when the world thinks you're broken, that's when you show them you are unbreakable. The room would always fall silent after those words, the weight of them pressing deeper than any lesson on tactics or weapons. And Isabella, the medic who became the predator, would step away, her braid swinging against her back, her eyes steady. Not a ghost anymore. Not a hero either. Just a soldier who carried the truth that some prisons cannot hold you, because the strongest walls are the ones you refuse to accept.